committed to scholarship. And one of the things he longed to see was students trained as scholars to go out and answer the questions of the world. Miami, the former Department of Comparative Religion, sponsored a speaker, and the title was "The Jesus of Q as a Liberation Theologian." That would take a lot of definition just to explain what the title was. But the speaker was a guy who did not believe in the resurrection of Jesus, did not believe that the Gospels were really the original writings. He said he was a member of a church, but I couldn't figure out why he would bother. And at the end of the lecture, he gave 2 lectures, one Sunday, one Monday. And Miami gave him an honorary doctorate, a DHL. And Kimmy Yamauchi afterwards said, "This is Ed's concerns. Where are the scholars who are going to answer these questions?" And to honor him, we set up this lecture series to present Christian scholars. And for you who are Christian students, to think about maybe there's a calling to academia. And I'm not sure there's anybody better around than Dr. Ken Elzinga as a Christian witness, as a faculty member at the University of Virginia. Tim Cameron's going to introduce Dr. Elzinga in a few minutes, but I want to give you a little health report. Dr. White's in the hospital. Most of you might know that. He came down with an infection on Monday, and it has to do both with his appendix and his colon. So they were going to operate, they decided not to, and they're treating with antibiotics. So Dr. Elzinga and Tim Cameron and I visited today in the hospital. He wanted to ask Ken Elzinga, what happens if the United States defaults on it? And what's going to happen with interest rates? He'd been reading economics in preparation for Dr. Elzinga's coming. So he's alert enough to ask questions, and his report today was much more encouraging. So he's encouraged, and he hopes to be out of the hospital and back to the Knolls in a matter of a couple of days. So that's what I wanted to mention about him. You can read about him in this program. I would also point out that in here is the list of all the speakers and topics from the past 20 years. 2006 was the first one. And you can also see inside, if you open it up all the way, the speaker for next year and the date for next year. Dr. Y told me that this Dr. Edward Cook is the foremost expert on the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we look forward to having him next year. So welcome, and I'll ask Tim Cameron. Dr. Tim Cameron is the Associate Dean of School of Engineering. How many years have you been there? 15. And he's retiring. His secretary, well, one of the administrative assistants. I was very strongly told by the administrative assistant that there are no secretaries in the university, only administrative assistants. Anyway, put a sign next to his door saying, "I'm retiring in how many days?"
Like 125.
He didn't do that, she did. So. And he came here from Kettering University in Flint, which used to be the General Motors Institute, and before that he was in Virginia as well. So Tim Cameron, Jane Armstrong, Jim Samlin, I don't see where Jim is, I saw him before, but Jim Samlin's right there, and I and Taylor Scott are on the committee, and we're all listed on that program too. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Dennis. So when we visited Dr. Yamauchi in the hospital, he asked me to, he would normally be giving this introduction, he asked me to give the introduction. I said, I would much rather do a video recording of you doing the introduction, because I can play that on on the screen, but he refused, so unfortunately, he also specifically wanted, he's a dedicated historian, he's got an encyclopedic mind, and he wanted what he intended to share and asked me to share is a very early historical connection between Miami University and the University of Virginia in the person of William Holmes McGuffey. If you're not familiar with Professor McGuffey, he was a professor here at Miami University. I think he started around 1826. He was one of the very first faculty members here. He was ordained as a Presbyterian minister in 1829. And right around then is when he started writing McGuffey's Eclectic Readers. He had a publishing contract with a publisher in Cincinnati to publish these readers. Those readers, I think they were from first grade to sixth grade, first to second, so on, eclectic readers, were the principal textbook of education in the United States for the 1800s and the 1900s, well through the 20th century. They are still in print. They're widely used by homeschoolers and they're widely used in Christian schools. A lot of very practical lessons. They standardized a lot of the structure of the English language. They were so widely used. They were universally used. So William Holmes McGuffey started writing those here at Miami University. His home at the corner of Spring and Oak Street, is that right? Is now a museum. It's open on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday afternoons from 1 to 5. If you haven't seen it, please go see it. The desk where he started to write those McGuffey's readers is there. You know how we like to have multiple screens around our desk now? Well, he had an octagonal desk so he could spread out all his writing materials and work on his books. By the way, he was a close friend of Lyman Beecher, the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet's husband, Calvin Stowe, was a Miami professor. And so Lyman Beecher had a connection to Miami, and he came to know William Holmes McGuffey, and it was Lyman Beecher who was very instrumental in William Holmes McGuffey coming here to Miami as a professor. Well, I forget what year, but he left, McGuffey left Miami, became president of a short-lived college in Cincinnati. He then went on to become the president of Ohio University in Athens. By the way, he increased the enrollment there enormously, but he was unpopular with the townfolk because they liked to farm on the university grounds, and he planted elm trees around the grounds to prevent the farm implements from coming through. So one time, as he and his wife were walking home, he got mud thrown at him. And he said to his wife, "We're gone." They came back to Cincinnati for a few years, and then he went to the University of Virginia, which is where he spent the majority of his career, and William Holmes McGuffey is buried in Charlottesville. But there's a very early connection between our two universities. So that's my instructions from Dr. White, history lesson. Now let me introduce our speaker tonight. We are very privileged to hear from one of the most preeminent Christian scholars in the world, an economist who's going to speak to us on the topic of Christianity, capitalism, and socialism. Dr. Ken Elzinga holds the Robert C. Taylor Chair in Economics at the University of Virginia, where he has taught since 1967. And I owe an apology to a number of you. When I saw that he started in 1967, I thought he had to be retired. So I sent out an email saying, retired. And I'm wrong. He's still teaching there. He's just on leave this semester. He said he used to work for Cambridge University, the University of Chicago, and a number of other places. Dr. Elzinga was the first recipient of the Cavaliers Distinguished Teaching Professorship at UVA. He is also the recipient of UVA's Alumni Association's Distinguished Professor Award, the Commonwealth of Virginia Outstanding Faculty Award, and awards in education from the Keenan and Templeton Foundations. In 1992, he was given the Thomas Jefferson Award, the highest honor the University of Virginia affords its faculty. Each fall, Dr. Elzinga's introductory economics course attracts over 1,000 students, turns away 300 students every time it's offered. It's the largest class offered at the University of Virginia. And in the spring, his antitrust policy seminar, which is taught using the Socratic method, requires an application essay and is by invitation only, and often has a waiting list of 2 years or even longer. I would venture to say, given the size of the university, that Dr. Elzinga is probably the most popular instructor in the history of the University of Virginia, just as my guess. Dr. Elzinga's research interest is antitrust economics, especially pricing strategy and market definition. He's testified in several precedent-setting antitrust cases, and he was the economics expert for the prevailing parties in 3 Supreme Court cases. He's the author of over 100 academic publications, but he's also written 4 mystery novels under the pen name Marshall Jevons, where the protagonist employs economic analysis to solve the crime. The latest is The Mystery of the Invisible Hand. The novels have been used in classrooms across the country to illustrate introductory economic principles and have been translated into 7 languages. I'm going to skip some of this. Dr. Elzinga told me it was too long. He has his BA and an honorary doctorate from Kalamazoo College. He has his PhD from Michigan State, and several other honorary doctorates. But Dr. Elzinga is also a strong witness to Christ in the university. He speaks at InterVarsity Christian Fellowship staff conferences, crew staff conferences, and many other Christian academic associations. He's also on the board of directors for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. So Dr. Elzinga and I visited Dr. Yamauchi today, along with Dennis Dudley, and Dr. Elzinga shared that he prefers to be called Mr. Elzinga. I didn't know this before, but he prefers Mr. Elzinga because Thomas Jefferson did not want UVA faculty to be called professors or doctor. Jefferson wanted UVA to be a democratic and egalitarian community of scholars. So please give a warm Miami Redhawk welcome to Mr. Elzinga, a cavalier from our sister public Ivy, which those in Charlottesville reverently refer to as Mr. Jefferson's University.
I'm going to do a quick mic check. Can people hear me in the back okay? Can I just see a hands up? Great, thank you very much. If you've listened to many talks, at least in the United States, you know how common it is for speakers to begin by saying how delighted they are to be here. Usually that statement is a fabrication. Truth be told, the speakers would rather be at the beach or reading a good book or maybe taking a hike. But I can honestly say that I am delighted to be here. In fact, honored is the better word. For years, literally for years, ever since I first met the man at the University of Virginia in 1976 when he gave a Staley lecture there, I have admired Ed Yamauchi as a person who modeled the confluence of excellent scholarship and faithful Christian witness. And he's done so for what economists call the long run. The topic that I've been asked to address in the Yamauchi Lecture, Capitalism, Socialism, and Christianity, could hardly be a broader one. Each word, capitalism, socialism, Christianity, is a portmanteau expression. You could unpack these words for days and not be finished. They've occupied many, many books and many, many pages. So I'm going to do what economists are good at, and that's deploying resources efficiently under a budget constraint. It's choosing words sparingly while operating under a time limit of 60 minutes. But that means I'm going to inevitably disappoint some of you. You're going to complain that I didn't talk about income distribution or the environment or the federal deficit or housing policy or religious liberty or inflation or tariffs, to pick a topic that random, or if you're my age, the military-industrial complex. And all I can say is guilty as charged. So let me first define the last word in the title of my talk, Christianity, because here I can be efficient. I define Christianity as a religion whose characteristics are expressed in the Apostles' Creed. Christianity is summarized by the Apostle John when he wrote, "And this is God's command, to believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and to love one another as he commanded us." That's the Christianity I'm talking about, what C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity. In my definition of the Christian religion, the words capitalism and socialism don't appear, nor do they appear in the scriptures of the Christian faith. Nonetheless, it would be idle to contend that capitalism and socialism are disconnected from the Christian faith. Capitalism, socialism, are economic systems that are designed to generate income and wealth. Christianity is a religion that is very much concerned with income and wealth. In particular, how income and wealth are acquired and how income and wealth are deployed. Capitalism and socialism are alternative methods to produce income and wealth, and the question before the House this evening is how capitalism and socialism connect to the Christian faith. That is one compatible and the other is not? Is one better than the other? If I'm a follower of Jesus, should I care whether I live under capitalism or socialism? And I plan to address these questions, but I'm going to do so indirectly by first telling a story. The story is not one that begins with a man walks into a bar. Rather, in this story, a young woman walks into an econ professor's office. She's a student at the University of Virginia, and the office she walks into is mine. And we go through the basics of getting acquainted. I learned that her father owns a business that sells plumbing supplies, and her mother's a homemaker. And the student wants to talk to me about careers. Now, so far, there's nothing unusual in the story. The student tells me she wants to have a career where she can, as she put it, help people. And she asked me about some nonprofit organizations, and we talked about them. I've been on the board of a number of nonprofit organizations. But I also inquire about her going into the family business, the plumbing supply company that her father owns and operates. And she says no, she isn't interested in joining the family business, rather she wants a career where she can help people as opposed to make money. Now, in my student's mind, a career path that she is rejecting involves the for-profit sector, where the operative words are the pursuit of money, greed, and self-interest. The career path that she favors involves the not-for-profit sector, where the operative words are the common good and public service. So we ask yourself this question: is it better to pursue your self-interest or pursue the common good? And that question seems to answer itself. My student perceived a fork in what economists call the labor market, of the private sector versus the public sector, or the for-profit sector versus the not-for-profit sector. And for this talk, I'm going to paint with a broad brush and consider that fork capitalism versus socialism. Fundamentally, how do they differ? And what do their differences have to do, if anything, with following Jesus? And let's start with socialism. As a matter of history, socialism has been identified with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics under Joseph Stalin, the National Socialist German Workers' Party under Adolf Hitler, and the British Labour Party under Clement Attlee. Now let's pause for a moment and let that fact about socialism settle in. Communism in Russia, Nazism in Germany, the Labour Party in Great Britain, all variations on socialism. So here's a slide that I had AI generated. This is Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler, and Clement Attlee. And they're all wearing t-shirts with the word socialist printed on the front. Query, how can that be? One way to answer that question is to turn to socialism's roots and inquire of Friedrich Engels, a close friend and collaborator of Karl Marx. And in 1880, Engels wrote this: two great discoveries, the materialist conception of history, that is, history without God, and revelation of the secret of capitalist production through surplus value. And we owe them both to Marx. With these discoveries, socialism becomes a science. The next thing was to work out all of its details and relations. So according to Marx and Engels, socialism is a science, and if you put it into practice, the result would be the collapse of capitalism and the rise of socialism. And according to Engels, to achieve an economic utopia was a matter of working out the science of socialism. Putting socialism into practice meant central planning of the economy as opposed to an economy governed by markets. Now, some 40 years after Engels, the British Labour Party endeavored to work out what Engels called the details and relations of socialism. Clause 4 of the Labour Party's platform stated, and see it on the slide, to secure for the workers the most equitable distribution possible on the basis of the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, and the best obtainable system of control of each industry or service. Public ownership of the means of production as opposed to private property, and the allocation of resources by a central plan as opposed to market processes represents the economic organization of socialism. And those on the political left who favor socialism rarely acknowledge the connection between socialism and Hitler. They try to connect the Nazis with fascism or capitalism, and that is not easy to do. Nazi, after all, is shorthand for the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And if that were not enough, Hitler's words connect him to socialism. In 1941, it was in July, Hitler made this claim: "A sensible employment of the powers of a nation can only be achieved with a planned economy from above." Now, I want to be clear here. There is a huge difference between the British Labour Party and Hitler's Nazi Party with regard to public ownership of the means of production. The Nazi Party was more tolerant of private ownership, but that was under conditions that were de jure, not de facto. As early as 1937, Hitler made this statement: "I tell German industry, you have to produce such and such now. If German industry were to answer me, we're not able to, then I would say, fine, then I will take it over myself, but it must be done. But if industry tells me we will do that, then I'm very glad that I do not have to take that on." The difference, and it's a profound one, is that the British Labour Party had a purported agenda of securing economic benefits for the workers. We see that on the slide. Whereas the National Socialist Workers' Party had a different agenda, indeed: kill the Jews and take control of Europe. Now, what's been the result of scientific socialism worked out in what Engels called the details and the relations? I'm going to respond bluntly here. Not one of Marx's predictions about the fall of capitalism and the rise of socialism came true. Not one. Apart from the continuing attempts at socialism in places like North Korea and Cuba and Venezuela, today hardly anyone, at least in the West, even uses the word socialism to mean the political systems of Soviet communism, Nazism, or the former British Labour Party agenda, as you see in Clause 4. Socialism's economic agenda no longer calls for a 5-year plan or a great leap forward, as once was the case. But, however, socialism's aspirational agenda for an economic system that functions for the common good lives on in the minds and hearts of many, many people, including many of my students. Socialism claimed it would end poverty, achieve equality, and bring about social harmony. For those with what Thomas Sowell calls an unconstrained vision, these are very noble ideals. But for those with what Sowell calls a constrained vision, those ideals represent the allure of sirens. That is, sirens like those in Homer's Odyssey, which resulted in the economic shipwrecks of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The sorry track record of central planning and public ownership of the means of production has persuaded many to restrain their enthusiasm for socialism's original tenor and DNA and flavor. This is how Gary Sloan Morrison puts it. In Western Europe, socialism settled down into the social democratic parties of the center left. A good example of that was Tony Blair when he was prime minister. He wanted a market-friendly revision to the Labour Party's Clause 4, which is still on the screen. That had called for the public ownership of British industry. public ownership, central coordination. Those were once the necessary conditions of socialism. They have become passé. Instead, socialism has morphed into a network of agencies issuing regulations, administering penalties, designed to influence economic agents to behave in a particular way that the government mandates. By a kind of linguistic jujitsu, the external form of socialism changed, but the internal similarities remain the same. In terms of taxonomy, very few people label a highly regulated economy as socialistic. But neither is that economy something that ought to be called capitalism, or what Adam Smith called the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. Some people refer to the modern form of socialism as the administrative state. Now we turn to capitalism, a term that carries a lot of baggage because capitalism is so often defined by a cultural distinctive, like consumerism, or by a particular motivation, like greed, or it's connected to a particular form of international relations, like globalism. Or the word capitalism is linked to another word, and it becomes democratic capitalism. And I'm uneasy about using the word capitalism because so many people, including a lot of my students, identify capitalism with the economies of Western Europe and the United States. And by that definition or taxonomy, capitalism really is a very complex alliance between government and business, as well as coalitions between government and organized labor. And that's not how I'm going to unpack the term capitalism. I'm going to go back to Adam Smith, the founder of modern economics, and he claimed that capitalism was based on people's propensity, and here I'm quoting Smith, to truck, barter, and exchange. Let me put this slide on the screen. The profile of Adam Smith and one of his famous statements about how he viewed a propensity, an inner drive, a characteristic of human beings to truck, barter, and exchange. Now, the word truck is a tricky one here because for most of my students, a truck is a pickup truck, or it's a dump truck. But to Smith, in his time, to truck was a verb. It meant to trade, to buy and sell. So today we might say to buy and sell, a propensity to buy and sell, barter, and exchange. And a necessary condition for capitalism to work is private property and markets where individuals can exchange property rights by way of voluntary transactions. In other words, private property is a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition, but it's a necessary condition for capitalism to function. So what goods are going to be produced, how they're going to be produced, for whom they're going to be produced, these decisions get made under capitalism by market forces of consumer demand and seller supply. And they draw scarce resources into some uses and they push them away from others. Capitalism in its economic sense can be called a market system or a price system. Adam Smith referred to it as the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. That's a Smithian definition. Capitalism is the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. Now, speaking of Adam Smith, his counsel to the young woman in my office, everybody remember her? Was based on something that's a mystery to many people. And Smith called this mystery the invisible hand. And using this metaphor, Smith claimed that by the workings of an invisible hand, the common good can be approximated when people pursue their self-interest. And how can that be? Here's one way to think about Smith's metaphor. If today we realized that our supply of toothpaste was running low, or we needed a new USB charging cord, none of us, I'm just going to simply assert, I don't know all of you, but I'm going to assert that none of us attending the Yamauchi Lecture would lose any sleep worrying that these items won't be available for us to purchase come Monday. That is, we attach a high probability that these items will be sitting on the shelves of a brick and mortar store, or they'll be available to us for online purchase. And it's true that right now there are thousands of goods and services being produced and transported to Oxford, Ohio, and Oxford, Mississippi, and Oxford, Michigan, and all the other Oxfords in the United States. And they're gonna arrive, not because it's traditional that certain tribes or families send them to the cities called Oxford, where there's some central authority that's decreed they're gonna show up in cities called Oxford. And they're not gonna arrive here because some individuals decided to pursue the common good to make this happen. They're gonna show up, to use Adam Smith's metaphor, as if by an invisible hand. Adam Smith's most famous illustration of the invisible hand is this. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. Or to put it differently, we don't appeal to the benevolence and good nature of those who make toothpaste and USB charging cords, and we don't appeal to their desire to help other people in order to persuade them to make these items available. The mystery of the invisible hand is that we appeal to a merchant's self-interest. And in the process, we're going to have our toothpaste and our USB charging cords and other stuff that we need. For most businesses to succeed in the long run, they've got to be other regarding in their actions. Now let me return one last time to the young woman who came to my office whose family owns a plumbing supply business. So this firm buys plumbing supplies from a manufacturer, shoulders the cost of holding them in inventory, hoping that some customers will decide to purchase these items on terms that will sustain the operation of the firm and allow the owner to provide for his family. So you ask yourself, how can such an organization ever be an instrument of injustice or oppression? If you were to withhold the supply of plumbing equipment, that might be unjust. But supplying these goods to willing and informed buyers, in Smith's view, could not be unjust. That's why, in the case of voluntary exchange between an informed buyer and an informed seller, each party, the seller and the buyer, can say thank you to the other when that transaction is consummated. This is what economists call gains from trade. And the remarkable implication of Adam Smith's invisible hand is that the student who walked into my office might help people more, or help more people, if upon graduation she ran the family plumbing supply business at a profit, rather than doing something with the express purpose of helping people for the common good. The underlying economic logic here is hidden and it is obscure to many, particularly those who want to do good but cannot imagine doing good while doing well. Now I want to return to socialism, and I want to put it under a different lens than that of economic productivity. I want to substitute a biblical lens. And in so doing, I'm going to contend that socialism is a modern day promise of and program for overcoming the consequences of the biblical fall. What do I mean by that? Let me go back to Marx and Engels and all the like-minded scribes and politicians who followed. They envisioned a world that was free of nature's tooth and claw. They envisioned a world of communal sharing rather than individual competition. They envisioned a world of abundance and not scarcity. They also envisioned a world without an intervening or demanding God. Socialism in all its various flavors can be seen as the story of the Tower of Babel writ large. This is the Tower of Babel writ large. In his commentary on the book of Genesis, Leon Cass showed that the Tower of Babel represented man's quest for self-sufficiency and man's quest for fame and immortality. Viewed through the biblical lens, the theory behind socialism, that man could become the master of his own social organization, is as old as the Tower of Babel. Here's a slide with Friedrich Engels and one artistic rendition of the Tower of Babel. Cass's interpretation of the ancient story of Babel has its contemporary counterpart in the socialism of Marx and Engels. By virtue of its absence of reverence the vaunt of pride, the trust in technique, and the quest for material power. And the whole aspiration for self-sufficiency, the desire to reach into heaven, in short, the implied wish to be as gods, with comparable creative power. Now listen to these words of Friedrich Engels, who wrote, "The whole sphere of the conditions of life which environ man, and which have hitherto ruled man, old age, now under socialism comes under the dominion and control of man, who for the first time becomes the real conscious lord of nature, because he now has become master of his own social organization." Close quote. The vision of Engels was the Tower of Babel. As an economic arrangement, socialism hasn't lived up to its promises. Socialism leaves unanswered this fundamental question: why should those who engage in planning our lives know better for us than we ourselves? Now, I go back to Adam Smith one more time. He recognized early on the fallacy of those who would presume to be able to control others. This is a long quote from Smith. I always hesitate to put long quotes before my students. It's real easy to lose them. But let me just walk through this quote from Adam Smith. He's talking about the central planner, and he compares it to a chess game. The central planner seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society, that is, you and I, with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces on a chessboard. He, that is the central planner, doesn't consider that the pieces on the chessboard have no other principle of motion besides that which the hand impresses upon them. But that in the great chessboard of human society, the world in which we live and have our being, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from that which the legislature might choose to impress upon it. And Adam Smith wrote his great book, The Wealth of Nations. The year was 1776. The experience of most people over the whole span of human existence was one of grinding, hopeless poverty. That was the world. Poverty with no relief, poverty with no expectation of improvement. And Smith decided, I want to look at it and try and explain this handful of aberrations, why some nations were escaping this state. And that's why the full title of Smith's masterpiece is An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. We sometimes hear the question, what's in a name? Well, what about the name Adam Smith? How fitting is that? Adam, the name of the first man, gets paired with Smith. That's the most common surname in the English language. The Bible tells us that God put a man named Adam in a garden so that he might flourish, and that particular episode didn't go well. We know that wealth became the province of royalty, potentates, religious and military leaders, while poverty was the plight of almost everyone else. And then after countless generations of hardship, stemming from the shortcomings of one man named Adam, along came another man with the name Adam, who wrote a book that tells us how even the Smiths of the world, the ordinary people, the little guys, might flourish. And they would enjoy goods and services that leaders of old could not have imagined consuming. And that book was about capitalism. Of what value, then, is socialism? The attraction of socialism cannot be explained by an economic rationale, because capitalism outperforms socialism in terms of generating a higher per capita GDP, in terms of the rate of technological progress. The market system beats central planning simply in terms of delivering more goods and services, more food and shelter to ordinary people. The attraction of socialism is its aspirational character. I'm going to quote here from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. The story of Babel is a drama about the two key words in the first sentence of the Torah. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Heaven is the domain of God. Earth is the domain of man. by attempting to build a tower that would reach heaven. The builders of Babel were men trying to be like gods. Now let me go back to capitalism. A criticism of the market system is its economic success or excess, or what Thorsten Veblen called conspicuous consumption. And this question deserves to be asked. Should we not be concerned if in the process of capitalism producing lots of goods and services, people are likely to become even more greedy and covetous than they would otherwise be? So I'll try to put the question theologically. I'm not a theologian. If capitalism enables us to have goods and services in such abundance, as a consequence, does capitalism cause us to lose our souls? Now, in the Gospel according to Luke, Jesus tells a story about a rich man. Today, I would call him a capitalist because he owns land and buildings. That is, he owns capital. And according to the story, this capitalist decides to build even more buildings. He wants even more wealth. And in doing so, the wealthy capitalist hopes to be able to, according to the scriptures, take life easy and eat and drink and be merry. And God says to the wealthy capitalist, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you, then who will get what you've prepared for yourself?" And Jesus concludes the parable with a warning. This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves but is not rich towards God. So let me raise this question about capitalism versus socialism. It's a subtle one. Does an economic system that's unquestionably remarkable at churning out goods and services, which is motivated by people primarily pursuing their self-interest, does that make people more covetous? That is, does free enterprise produce people who already have a lot of stuff to want even more? Perhaps. But I'm not persuaded that the blame for covetousness can be laid at the feet of capitalism. Wanting more, that is, coveting material possessions, was around long before the modern market economy. And commandments, after all, have a do not covet prohibition. Now, this is a question sometimes raised by my students who may or may not realize its theological basis. Isn't capitalism based on greed, and isn't greed bad? Now, that's what lawyers call a compound question. Let me respond to the second part first. Yes, greed is bad. It deserves its place among the 7 deadly sins. Greed is so bad that it warrants 2 condemnations in the Bible, as stealing and as covetousness. Contrary to what corporate raider Gordon Gekko said in the motion picture Wall Street, if anybody remembers that movie, greed is not good, and economics does not contend that it is. One could describe a business owner's desire for profits as greed, but you could also describe a government official's desire for power as greed. Brian Kaplan once put it this way, that politicians crave power is as undeniable as that business people crave profits. The enduring problem of socialism, the enduring problem with any form of central planning, is to incentivize power-hungry officials to operate in the interest of citizens. Just as the enduring problem of capitalism is to incentivize business firms to operate in the interest of consumers and employees. Now, C.S. Lewis, I've read a lot of Lewis. I'm a Lewis fan in so many ways. I've been to his home, I've taken Addison's walk, I go to the Wade Center, I look at Lewis memorabilia. He was not a student of economics, but he was a student of the Bible, and he understood the doctrine, profoundly understood the doctrine of the fallen nature of man. And for this reason, Lewis did not expect anyone who is engaged in public planning under socialism to be any better, any more benevolent, any more altruistic than those who pursued their self-interest in the private sector. Indeed, an interesting interpretation of Lewis is he suggested that those who are employed as government planners and regulators will be worse than those who run business firms. Lewis thought this was the case because they had more power. These are Lewis's words. All that can really happen, and he's referring to socialism in Great Britain, is that some men will take charge of the destiny of others. They will be simply men, none perfect, some greedy, cruel, and dishonest. The more completely we're planned, the more powerful they will be. Have we discovered some new reason why, this time, power should not corrupt as it had done before? So one way capitalism incentivizes business firms to operate in the interests of consumers is by having them compete with each other for consumer patronage. Does that work? Does it happen? Here's a tongue-in-cheek way to compare capitalism with socialism. It's to perform what Germans call a Gedanken experiment. A Gedanken experiment, if you don't know the term, is an experiment that doesn't require a laboratory. You just use your imagination and your own experience. So in this Gedanken experiment, imagine the difference between the greeting one hears upon entering Chick-fil-A or a Nike outlet store versus entering an office of the IRS or the Division of Motor Vehicles. Upon entering Chick-fil-A or a Nike outlet store, you're likely to be asked something like, "How may I help you?" I don't know your experience, but in the Commonwealth of Virginia, if you enter the office of the IRS or the DMV, you're likely to be told, "Take a seat." Very different approach with people who come to that office. Now, many years ago, when I was a student at Kalamazoo College, I took a class in public speaking. My teacher, I still remember her very well, was Professor Nelda Balch. And Professor Balch told me that whenever I gave a speech, I should let the audience know when I'm getting near the end. And I didn't see her tell my classmates this, so I asked her why. And she told me, "Kenny," I was called Kenny when I was in college. "Kenny," she said, "if you let them know you're near the end, this will revive hope among your audience." Let me tell you, I'm drawing to a close, and I'm going to do so by going back to Adam Smith and to the Bible. It's a gross distortion of Adam Smith's contribution to economics that Smith equated self-interest with selfishness. Smith did not. He understood the two were quite different. So when scholars write about Adam Smith's life, they often point to Smith's friendship with David Hume. David Hume was arguably the most famous atheist of his day. But I'll tell you what's less commonly known, is that Smith's admiration for Presbyterian ministers of his day. Smith himself was a student of Francis Hutcheson, who, it's hard to believe this today, was both a minister in the Church of Scotland and he was a professor at the University of Glasgow. And Smith deeply admired these scholar pastors like Hutcheson, who themselves were deeply affected by the Protestant Reformation. So while Smith is commonly thought to have made an economic case for free markets and voluntary exchange, the Reformed theologians who influenced Smith were making a theological case for free markets and voluntary exchange. And it's in this grain that I'm going to mention a Bible story that would have met with Smith's approval. The story shows up in the life of Jesus when Jesus was asked to define who was someone's neighbor. And Jesus responds by telling a very brief story, usually called the parable of the Good Samaritan. Maybe you know the story, but if not, it involves a man, implicitly a Jew, who's traveling on a road, and he's set upon by robbers, who not only take his belongings, they beat him. And they beat him severely. And they leave him half dead alongside the road. And in the story, according to Jesus, two religious Jews traveled on this road, and they passed by on the other side. And what makes the story memorable, even astonishing, is that a Samaritan, someone who was not a Jew, someone who was looked down upon by many Jews as an outsider, this Samaritan comes along, and he treats the wounds of the man who was beaten and robbed. And he's not only sympathetic to the man's plight, but he took him to a place of shelter. And he paid for his care. There's a slide with a picture, an artistic rendition of the Good Samaritan. Now, Now, the conventional interpretation of the parable of the Good Samaritan is to be compassionate to those who are in need. Close reading reveals the economics of the story. Instead of calling this the parable of the Good Samaritan, Adam Smith might have called it the parable of the well-to-do Samaritan, or the parable of the Samaritan who had a lot of money in his pocket. Because if the Samaritan had no wealth, he could not have helped this poor man the way he did. Neighborly love meant exercising compassion, but the Good Samaritan's love required economic capacity to exercise it. That is, the Samaritan had to have resources, income or wealth, in order to provide for the poor guy who was beaten and robbed. An economic formula for love would be love equals compassion plus capacity. If you have capacity without compassion, that's selfishness. But if you have compassion without capacity, that's just frustration. It may be better to give than to receive, but to do this, you've got to have something to give. Now, what does this parable have to do with capitalism versus socialism? As Adam Smith revealed in The Wealth of Nations, capitalism has a track record of increasing capacity. The average individual under capitalism has more resources to give away. In addition, under a market economy, rather than an economy organized by the state, an individual cannot withhold giving to the poor on the grounds that giving to the poor is the job of the state. To my mind, one of the most remarkable connections between Adam Smith and looking after the interests of others is how the market system has enabled so many people to escape poverty so they have the economic capacity to be a good Samaritan. They have resources they can give away, to share, and use to help others. Now let me make what lawyers call a sidebar conversation here. Lawyers describe a sidebar as a conversation that carries information relating to the main story, but the sidebar is not the main story. I realize that socialists sometimes point to the early Christian church, where there was a sharing of assets based on what some members possessed and other members didn't. What's not mentioned is that this economic system was voluntary, not centrally planned, not mandated. Those engaged in this non-market economy presumably had a common Holy Spirit-inspired sense of community. And also, what's seldom mentioned is that throughout history, no such communal experiment on a large scale has ever succeeded in being economically productive. And history is full of failed attempts, large and small. Once upon a time, there was a singer named Frank Sinatra who had a theme song entitled My Way. And if you're in the audience, I'm looking at you guys maybe in particular, and you have no idea who Frank Sinatra is, he once was as big as the Beatles, and if you don't know who the Beatles are, they once were as big as Taylor Swift. I want you to consider, not just you guys, the whole group, I want you to consider the two words that comprise the title of Frank Sinatra's theme song, My Way. Then think about and compare these with arguably the two most famous words of Jesus, follow me. Now what a contrast. Frank Sinatra sings my way, but the Bible teaches there is a way, note the word way, that appears to be right, but in the end it leads to death. The promotion of ourselves, the promotion of our own desires, the I did it my way, commended in the Frank Sinatra song, can run rampant in a free market. So what's the problem with free market capitalism? Certainly not that it doesn't deliver the goods, it does. Certainly not that it requires the exercise of greed, it doesn't. Certainly not that it causes covetousness, it doesn't. When G.K. Chesterton was asked what's wrong with the world, he replied also in two words, I am. And C.S. Lewis would have recognized that's what's wrong with capitalism, is it's populated with people like us. People who come to believe it is by our might and our power that things are accomplished. And here's the rub. This is the rub. Because capitalism is such an extraordinary engine of abundance for so many, many become deluded into thinking, I did this. I really am the master of my fate, the captain of my soul. Many years, long before Adam Smith, Moses warned the Israelites of the dangers of falling into this way of thinking. He told the people of Israel, beware that you don't forget the Lord your God by not keeping his laws and decrees, which I command you today, lest when you have eaten and are full and have built beautiful houses and dwell in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and gold are multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, when your heart is lifted up and you forget the Lord your God, then you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gained you this wealth. And you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth. What makes the freedom of Jesus different than the freedom of free enterprise is that the freedom of Jesus is freedom from bondage. It's not bondage to the laws and regulations of socialism's central control. And it's not bondage to capitalism's astonishing array of goods and services. It's bondage to sin. And the Christian gospel tells us what to do with freedom. It's not Frank Sinatra's My Way. It's rather to know God and enjoy him forever, to love God and to love our neighbors. For reasons unclear to me, the term self-interest gets a bum rap in some Christian circles. The Bible distinguishes self-interest from selfishness. The Apostle Paul writes, look, each of you not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. In other words, the Apostle Paul, it's as if he presumes we're going to look to our own interests, and Adam Smith helps us understand the conditions wherein people looking to their own interests can promote the economic well-being of others. That is, don't pass by on the other side of those who are sore and afflicted. That's where the Apostle Paul comes in, and he admonishes his readers to look also to the interests of others. To my mind, one of the most remarkable connections between Adam Smith and looking after the interests of others is how the market system has enabled so many people to escape poverty so they have the economic capacity to be a good Samaritan. They have the resources to give away, to share, and use to help others. The market system generates economic capacity, but Jesus is the one who enables us to give it away. Let me close with a quote from Father Robert Sirico of the Acton Institute, talking about freedom. When freedom is divorced from faith, both freedom and faith suffer. Freedom becomes rudderless because the truth gives freedom its direction. And where does the truth come from? Christian faith claims the truth comes from the life and teachings of Jesus, who had the temerity as well as the authority to say that he's the way, the truth, and the life. And that draws my Yamauchi lecture to a close. Thank you for your attention. I understand we may have time for questions and dialogue.
Thank you very much, Dr. Elzinga, or Mr. Elzinga. We do have time for questions. I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first question, but please be thinking about what you'd like to ask, and I'll bring the microphone to you if you have questions. Your expertise is in antitrust policy. What risks do monopolies pose to free enterprise system, and what things have you contributed to antitrust policy to help preserve the proper functioning of a free market economy?
Okay, thank you for the question. It's a difficult one for me to compress. The professors love to profess and That's a question that's rich with implications for me. So it's really, in a way, a compound question. So let me take it one part and then the second part. Monopoly is a real danger to capitalism or free enterprise promoting consumer welfare. Monopoly in the traditional Econ 201 sense of the word hinders consumer welfare because a monopolist restricts output relative to the competitive open market equilibrium. Having restricted output, the price can be escalated. So in econ lingo, consumers lose what we call consumer surplus. So monopolies are a problem. They're a problem for two reasons. They're a problem in the sense of blackboard economics. They reduce consumer welfare. Consumers are, depending on what the term you use, exploited, gouged, they pay a higher price. They're not treated as well as they would be where you've got a group of firms competing for the consumer's patronage, and they compete along metrics of price and quality, and consumers are better treated. So, what do we do about it? Well, in the United States, we're very fortunate, going back to 1890, with the wisdom of a senator from this state, Senator Sherman, being not solely responsible, but largely responsible, if you read the congressional debates, which I've done, for the promotion of an idea that came to be called the Sherman Antitrust Act. And essentially, the Sherman Antitrust Act says a lot. The two things that it says most of all is that if you're a group of rivals in a particular market, you may not get together and collude on the price and output or the quality that you're going to charge. And that law has evolved in the United States in a pretty dramatic way to where price fixing, or cartels, to use the econ term, is a per se offense. Now, what does that mean? You remember your Latin, per se means in and of itself. So if 5 of you and I have firms in the same industry, and we get tired of competing with each other on price, and I keep losing my customers to you, to people over here, we say, why don't we just get together? Quit beating each other up on price competition and quality competition. Let's just all raise our price 20% and stick it there. If we're caught, we cannot go into court and say, oh, Your Honor, we were hungry, or we didn't know the law, or we took the cartel profits and we gave it all to the Salvation Army or Oxford Bible Fellowship. None of that is a defense. There is no defense. That's what we mean by per se law. So we have in the United States a very strict law against cartels and price fixing. And not only is there no defense, we'll probably go to jail. It's a criminal offense. So the antitrust laws have come along and said one of the problems of capitalism is if the firms don't compete. So we're going to make a law against price fixing. And that's really the bread and butter of antitrust in the United States and in other parts of the world. We export a lot of things. One of the things we've exported is antitrust regulation. And the other part is monopoly, where a firm dominates a market. It's a harder thing to solve, especially if the firm grew internally. And so one of the classic dilemmas is if a firm that grows internally, maybe by what we sometimes call superior skill, foresight, and industry. But it's now got 90% of the market. It's got a lot of market power, maybe the ability to keep out other firms. One of the things that I've done, I've been involved in a number of cases that have gone to the Supreme Court, and 4 of them. The first 3, I was on the prevailing side. The last one, my wife said you should have quit with 3. The last one was one that some of you probably know. It was the NCAA case. I was the economic expert for the NCAA and the 5 so-called power conferences. Losing side of that case. The 2 of the cases that I've been on the prevailing side dealt with predatory pricing. So one tactic that a monopolist might use to keep out rivals is predatory pricing. Charge a low price to drive out rivals. When the rivals then expunged from the market, then raising the price to recoup on the losses made during the predatory pricing period. And I worked out a model of how one looks upon that predatory pricing scheme is an investment decision. It's an investment in future monopoly profits. And the court has sort of adopted that general model of thinking about predation, and that's the way it works. And that's probably what I consider my main contribution to economic policy, is a more rational way of thinking about what do we mean by predatory pricing. Because as consumers, we want low prices. We benefit from that. We don't want to confuse a low price and penalize firms that are competing compete aggressively on price, but we also don't want to allow firms that compete so aggressively that they're able to drive up rivals. So there's a whole literature on that. I've been a part of that literature, but I tend to, I don't know what they call it, just out of the blue, the ability to be an economic expert in courts, in cases that have gone to the Supreme Court. And the court has reached decisions that I think are economically rational in terms of promoting consumer wealth. My North Star, what I do in antitrust, is consumer welfare. That's what I'm interested in.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna give deference to my mentor when I came in here as a chair.
I don't know if this is a quick question. A socialistic system or communistic system that comes to mind that's extremely productive is China. How do they, I mean, is that a counterexample of your statement that
Yeah.
no socialist?
There's no doubt that China identifies itself as a communist country. There's no hesitation about that. There's no doubt that the Chinese economy is very heavily regulated and controlled by the Communist Party with regard to investment decisions and so on. China is a fascinating economy to study. I'm by no means an expert. I've been to China, I've lectured there. I'm an honorary faculty member at Donghua University there, and I've lectured in China. I was on the board of directors of a company that was in China. So I have some experience. But having said that, much of the Chinese economy remains a mystery to me. I believe that much of its growth is basically the appropriation of American technology without regard to intellectual property rights. I don't think you could explain the success of China if it were not their access, some of it legitimate, some of it illegitimate, would never pass muster in the United States in terms of respect for intellectual property, but they have, to use an econ term, been able to free ride or appropriate those investments. They have certain elements now of markets where people can start a firm, but it's very clear, particularly if you are in a major industry of infrastructure, like apartments and so on, that there's enormous pressure by the central government to do this, that, or the other thing. There is a large measure of central control by a bureaucracy that far exceeds what we have in the United States. So I hesitate to use, it sounds almost too simplistic to say, well, there's this spectrum of thorough, all complete control. China tried that. It was an enormous blunder, caused massive starvation under Mao. They now began to combine a partial marketization of the economy, a much more aggressive appropriation of largely American technology, but not exclusively American, a lot of European technology as well, and still making it clear to business people that, and we have evidence of it, some of the most prominent entrepreneurs, that if you go out of step with the Communist Party, you will go in jail. You will simply disappear. And that's very different from the United States. Very, very different world from the United States. I still remember lecturing at Donghua, and faced an audience of faculty and students. Some of you have lectured perhaps in China or at foreign universities. And there's one guy in the audience who was wearing a tie, a white shirt, and a dark suit. Now, I wear a tie all the time. I'm a tie guy. So the only two people in the whole lecture room wearing a tie was a speaker and one guy sitting over here. And I asked my host, Professor Wu, I said, who is the guy in the tie? I'd like to meet him. I wear ties. And I said, well, that's a member of the Communist Party who's here to watch what you're saying. And it came up to me. But it would be inconceivable to me in a more market economy, if somebody comes to the University of Virginia to give a talk on economics of all things, that there would be somebody from the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or some federal agency watching to see what was said. So the level of control, and of course, those of you know that many Christians recently, Christian pastors, at some level, it's tremendously impressive, is a surveillance state. In that sense, liberty that we have here is just not enjoyed. And I think there's a connection between the freedom to buy and sell and the freedom to express views. I can still remember with sadness when I was in Beijing that some of the students that I knew of from the University University of Virginia could not go to church with me in Beijing because the church I was allowed to attend, they were not allowed to attend as citizens in China. That could never happen in a market economy. A market economy, you start a church, you buy some property, people can come, they can go, they get money. It's incredible freedom that we have as Christians in a market economy because we're not dependent upon the state for resources. You have to come up with resources, but if we get together, we volunteer stuff, we can start a church. Americans do that by every year, hundreds and hundreds of them. And if you think of just within the confines of an economy that would protect and allow church to thrive, to my mind, there's no question that the market system outperforms central planning. Because under central planning, your church has to be subservient, a supplement to the desires of the state. And thus far, we don't have that in the United States. Question over here.
Thank you very much. I have so many questions, we'd be here for another hour, but I'll try to boil it down as much as I can. It seems to me you've given two sort of very rarefied pictures that put the two on a rather uneven playing field. On the one hand, we have Adam Smith's ideas in this very, sort of idyllic 18th century England as capitalism was first developing, which seems to me extremely far from the world of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, where there are people who have so much money and there is still incredible poverty even just around us in southwestern Ohio. And on the other hand, sort of socialism as represented by Stalin and Hitler. Whereas in fact, in pre-revolutionary Russia, which happens to be my specialty, there were many forms of socialism. And the more popular forms of socialism were the agrarian, the peasant forms, where they were advocating things like cooperatives and things like that. So their goals were not at all state-controlled central planning and this kind of stuff. That is one particular form of socialism. It happens to be that the Bolsheviks were the ones who followed this, the Marxist-Leninist line succeeded in Russia, and then became the model that others followed, and of course did horrendous things, so I'm not going to argue that. I mean, that was a bastion of evil without any question. But that's not all there is to socialism, right? There were many other forms. And when we think about what they aim to do, right, if capitalism aims for profit, right, for me to get wealthier, ultimately, I don't see how that really is a Christian goal at all. Maybe it's not an anti-Christian goal, but it's certainly not a particularly Christian goal. There's been a thread throughout the history of Christianity of suspicion towards wealth. Whereas the goal of socialism is that everybody is equal, that everybody's cared for equally, that you don't have extremes between wealth and poverty, which seems to me actually much more compatible with my understanding of Christianity. So here we are in the 21st century, and we're still looking back to, radically different world in the late 18th century. Are we really not capable of coming up with a new economic model that somehow balances production of wealth without centralized control, but at the same time, also achieves some kind of equality? Like, for example, you have places in Europe where you have very productive capitalist economies, but also not the extremes of wealth and poverty that you have in the United States. And even your own answer about the monopoly comes back to the role of the government at the end of the day is not always just a negative one. There is a positive role for the government to play too. It has to be somehow the markets and the government have to work together.
Yeah, I guess I'll respond to two different levels. First, I'm not sure there was a question there. If there was, it was
Is
very
there not some
complex.
model?
So
Yeah.
it's really hard for me to respond with to what I never understood to be a question. But I will go back to what I said at the start. I said at the start, this lecture will never satisfy everybody here because it's so broad, and I can't go to things like you want to talk about income distribution, the environment, and so on. I said that at the outset, what the lecture would be, also said what it would not be. Now, I will respond to just a couple things. First of all, Europe, the Gini coefficients would indicate that for most Western European countries, income and wealth are more unequally distributed than in the United States. That's just what the data show. I'm not an expert on Gini coefficients, but the people I know in my department who look at that stuff, so people think, well, Sweden, for example, is seen as sometimes called the middle way. The Gini coefficient for Sweden, that's the economist measure of inequality, is greater in Sweden than it is in the United States. The index of economic freedom for Sweden is greater than it is in the United States. That's just what the Cato studies on economic freedom indicate. As to my role, my role is to try and keep markets competitive. To my mind, that's one of the best ways to help poor people. Sam Walton, I believe, as an entrepreneur, very, very wealthy man, has done more to help poor people than almost any government agency that I can think of. Now that's a rhetorical statement, but there's some truth behind it. That many, many people can afford things like sweatshirts and any number of consumer appliances that were out of the reach of people before because of a guy who said, I think people from small communities in the South ought to be able to buy stuff at prices that people pay in urban areas. And he developed a business model that made that happen. And I don't think there's anything unjust about his billions. He did a great deal of good for people out of my sort of family background. I'm first generation college. I grew up in a farm, went broke on a farm, went broke farming. I'm grateful for people that put up stores like that. And those are entrepreneurs. I'm grateful that we live in a world that has antitrust that tries to keep markets competitive. And to go directly to your question, no doubt about it, the Sherman Act was a federal piece of legislation. I'm very grateful for it. I'm a great promoter of it. I think it's one of the most important pieces of legislation because it's done so much to help consumer welfare. Now the stories about, you're the expert on Russia and so on. I don't pretend to be an expert, but I do think that cooperative arrangements are consistent with a free economy because they're cooperative, they're voluntary. I have no problem with a group of people getting together and forming a farmer's co-op, a buyer's co-op. I think that's wonderful. Where are you most allowed to do that in a market economy? Because it's voluntary. The government doesn't plan co-ops. People plan them. Okay, you had a question here right from the start.
Couple different questions. One of them is similar to Scott's, just, is it a false dichotomy, capitalism, socialism? Is there some other way of setting up an economy? That was one question. And then secondly, just clarification. I think what I heard you say was, if we have a market economy which allows people to pursue self-interest, and that market economy is fair, which I take it to be in your framework is the role of the government to establish it as fair, or to keep it fair, that then the common good will resolve by an invisible hand. Is that correct?
Yeah,
did I hear that?
I hesitate to use the word fair. I'm just saying people will be treated on a level playing field with regard to being a consumer, and they can spend their money the way they want. Sellers can enter businesses where they think they can make a buck because there's consumer demand. And we need a government. We need a government to establish property rights, first of all. We need a government, to go back to this gentleman's question, to help keep markets competitive. Otherwise, we know without antitrust laws, there would be cartels, there would be monopolies, and that affects consumer welfare. That's why I devoted most of my professional career as a scholar to the promotion of competitive markets, because I think they treat consumers more fairly than central planning does. To me, that's just the record generally of human history. Now, socialism, to go back again to this gentleman's question, and I stress this in my talk, or trying to, it has a powerful aspirational agenda. And thank goodness that it does. We want goals, we want an aspirational agenda. But to have an aspiration that gets tied to something that doesn't deliver the goods, to me that's a fool's errand. And I think generally free markets are more apt to help poor people than central planning. I mean, that's the history. We look at Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, to take those examples. It's a tragedy for everyday people there. It's a tragedy, not just for religious freedom, it's a tragedy for people who just want to feed their family. And Smith comes along and says, well, what kind of system is better than that? And Smith never said that markets were a utopia. I mean, one of the things that you get trained in economics, you do not become a utopianist. I mean, that's why we're called a dismal science. Because we have this view that you're not going to have a utopia, and the problem is the people who think they can arrange one, that's the C.S. Lewis thing, that they can arrange the people on the chessboard to have utopia. Well, it's probably not going to work. It's probably not going to work. So we look for what economists sometimes call a second best solution. The second best solution, the best we may have, would be markets that are competitively organized. So that if I'm a seller and I want to do business with you, you look at my goods and services and the price that I charge, and they better be good or you'll go to my rival. And so out of my self-interest, I may be greedy, I may not be greedy, but out of my self-interest, I want to provide a good or a service for you that's of value to you. So that when we exchange, we can each, as I said, say thank you. It's what economists call gains from trade. And when that works, it's wonderful. When it doesn't, then it doesn't always work. It doesn't work when there's asymmetric information. When the seller knows something that the customer doesn't know, or the customer knows something that the seller doesn't know. There's all kinds of conditions before this is going to function well. And the best we can hope for is it to function in a halfway decent fashion in a falling world. That's why it's the dismal science.
Your central question or central story has interested me in what decision did the young lady make as she entered the office? Being a pastor, I want to know what you decided to see, what direction she was headed.
Well, as I said,
Go into the plumbing business.
I am not opposed to the nonprofit sector. I have been on the board of 6 different nonprofit organizations. I care passionately about certain nonprofit organizations. But the thing I realize as an economist is that to give them a special status, a gold star, as being better than something else. What I often say to my colleagues when I'm on the board is that, yeah, we're in the nonprofit sector, but we're also in the non-tax sector. So that's a wake-up call for some people. I've been on the board 23 years with a Christian organization called InterVarsity. And we're a nonprofit organization. We're grateful for that. We don't have to pay taxes to the government, but I remind them we have a favored status here. We don't pay for fire departments and police departments and all that. We get the free ride on all that. So to my mind, there's nothing better about the nonprofit sector. There's nothing better about the private sector. They both have their role. Now, the young lady, when I saw that she really had no interest in selling plumbing supplies, we talked about nonprofit organizations that she could go to. I think she ended up at the Abundant Life Center, which is something my church started.
I thought your option, though, of making more contact right there in the business and doing more help there was a very viable one.
Oh yeah, look, there's no doubt that her father, he's not in Charlottesville, provides a wonderful service to ordinary people. You know, your toilet's running, and you know, now you can go there and you can get something. He'll tell you, take this home and you can probably fix it yourself. Or you can call a plumber, and the plumber has access to plumbing supplies to help you. This is a wonderful thing if your toilet's running or something like that, or your sink is stopped up. You know, these are things that go to the common good, but they're privately funded.
One or
Yes.
two more questions. We'll finish by 9:30.
Okay.
Thanks for the message tonight, Mr. Elzinga. I appreciate it. I'm curious, so as a follower of Jesus for a number of years, I was intrigued when you linked capitalism with a specific culture too, and I'm wondering, that connected something for me that one of my discomforts with the idea of capitalism might not be the economics of the system, but might be the culture that I equate with that system. And I'm wondering that, so speaking maybe as one within the church, how do we start to disconnect what we might see as the culture of capitalism in our American society from the economic system that I hear you advocating for
Thank you for
tonight.
your question, because that goes to what, in some ways, is responsive to this gentleman's question as well. That sure, I did set up abstract concepts, and that's probably because I got an hour with you. You know, if you and I teamed on a course, we would go into a lot more detail on these matters. But the setup, I mean, this is what we do when we model things. We try to understand the complexity of the real world by setting up abstract models, because the world itself is so buzzing confusion that if you don't have a model of some sort to think about, well, there is a difference between a central plan and a market. When I said talking about capitalism is really a problem, because for many people it is really a type of consumerism, and that's not what I'm talking about. You can have a system of markets of people who are ascetics, and they just exchange the basics of life, the basic item of clothing, the basic item of food. And you can have a market exchange that does that. You can have specialization in the division of labor, Adam Smith's world of natural liberty. But you don't have consumerism. Where does the consumerism come from? Well, I suggest it comes from the evil of the human heart. And what offsets it? Not markets. Markets don't do that. Markets, in fact, offer us so much stuff that if we're tempted to be the sin of consumerism, well, gosh, you know, maybe we should go somewhere else to avoid that sin. But I'm telling you, my travels in China have not persuaded me that communism squelches consumerism. My understanding is that in Russia, some of the leaders of the Communist Party led very nice lives in terms of their relative wealth compared to everybody else. I don't know if that's true or not, that's what I've heard. But consumerism, if you want to hear my views on consumerism and the antidote that the Christian faith offers, I'm allowed to say this, come to Oxford Bible Fellowship tomorrow, because I'm going to preach on stewardship. And it will be a very different talk than I'm giving here, I think. But that's what I've been asked to preach on tomorrow at Oxford Bible Fellowship, is the Christian perspective of stewardship. I'll give you one illustration that I'm going to give. It's very much an econ way of thinking, based on the Reformation. I call it a sin bias coefficient. So you're thinking about charity, and some charity comes along, maybe your church, Habitat for Humanity, something like that, and you really like what they do. And you decide, I'm going to give X to that. That's in your mind. But you're a product of this consumerism culture that we swim in. It's very hard to escape it. So if the Reformation doctrine is true about the evil that's within our human heart, that first thought, X, whatever's that number, let's say it's $100, is biased downward by a sin bias coefficient. And what you need to do is figure out your sin bias coefficient. So in my case, it's 3. So if I think I would give X, I need to multiply by 3 to offset the sin bias coefficient. I know Baptists, for whom it's 5. Some of this is 7. But anyway, I don't know what yours is, I'm not picking on you. But you have one, and it's greater than 1. Maybe it's 1.5, that would be great if it's that. But that's kind of what I'm going to get at, is what do we do with Jesus' admonition to be what you will never find in an economics textbook. You will never find these two words put together, a cheerful giver. When you talk about the economics of philanthropy, people talk about the economic motivation. It might be self-interest, the guy who gives money and then gets in the paper with a big check and is promoted. The Bible talks about that kind of person. It could be out of obligation, it could be out of a sense of guilt. The Bible says the Lord loves a cheerful giver. That's one of the things I want to talk about in the sermon tomorrow. A very different topic from today, however. Thanks for your question.
I apologize, I'm going to keep class slightly long, because I do want to give the last question to a student. Last question.
Okay.
Mr. Elzinga, thank you so much for this lecture. It was really informative. I have kind of a two-part question. One is to kind of have more of a theological bent to it, and also for an application as well. So would it be fair to assert that socialism is symptomatic of the greater, generally progressive tendency of man trying to collapse the God-ordained manifestation of order, that is there being a hierarchy of God reigning over creation and God giving jurisdiction to man to subdue the earth and glorify God through the productive stewardship of that creation? And then secondarily, more practically, what would be your exhortation in my generation who has shown themselves sympathetic to the lies of the enemy to not just be self-sufficient as was the case in the past, but also to be self-creating in terms of being able to identify however one wishes, be the author of their own destiny, etc. Thank you.
Okay, that is a compound question. I'll try to be efficient in deploying the words. The first statement that you read really does remind me of things like Cass and Sachs and others who've written about socialism and equated it to the Tower of Babel. That it's our attempt to reach up to God, to be as God. And we know, at least within a biblical framework, that that's wrong. The sort of market counterpart to that is, as I suggested in a sort of funny way, Frank Sinatra, the My Way. It's not a collective effort to reach up to God, we're going to build this tower, but it says, I'm the master of my own fate. And that's equally wrong from a biblical perspective. So what I try to communicate to the students that I teach at the University of Virginia is to avoid the desire to be control over others. You may not be suitable to do that. They may not want to be controlled. But also to avoid I'm the master of my own fate. That poem is one of the most anti-Christian poems you can encounter. That I'm the master, the captain of my soul, the master of my fate. That is not true. We are called to be a follower of Jesus. And the striking thing about that, for me, we've got all these honors that we talked about earlier, is to recognize that, look, all that stuff that I have unexpectedly had given to me is nothing compared to the riches of knowing Jesus. It's just nothing. And what am I really in my identity? It's not all the stuff that's in the introduction. It's that I belong to Jesus. That's my identity. And that's not only all I have, that's enough. And to try and communicate that to students, particularly in the kind of world that you're describing over here with the consumerism, is a real challenge. It is hard to follow Jesus in conditions of poverty, in conditions of religious oppression, like you might have in China. It's very hard to follow Jesus under conditions of great affluence and opportunities, because going all the way back to that passage in Deuteronomy, it's so easy for us to say, oh, I did this, I earned this, and to come back to the central proposition of the gospel. It's all just grace, Ken. It's just grace. That's it. Thank you for your question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Elzinga, for your very enlightening and interesting talk, and thank you all for coming. He will be speaking at Oxford Bible Fellowship at both the 9 o'clock and the 10:30 a.m. services. Thank you.
Those years, I didn't even know that they were criminals to be enemy of the This was in 2012, but you know, I'm not really into politics.
You phrased your question much better than I was trying to ask the same question.
No, it's fine. No, it's fine. Hey, I want to introduce my dad.
That was Wednesday. That's where they go. I did not know until we came out of Alabama who that was. That was what?
Hey, man, how are you? Yeah, this is my dad.
Bad. I mean, it was like something like Russia. Did I ever show? I should show you the place we went to eat. Did I show you the place? I'll take you.
I know. It's starting to fall. It's just like for a long time.
This guy really.
But now we lost the department. I was trying to get it. Turns out it might have not been good at less than
I'm glad you asked me the question.
Yeah.
I want to keep pressing on it.
Yeah, exactly.